Hey guys, what's up? Today we're going to be doing a review of the live stream Q&A that the devs did. Um, they talked about a lot of the things that are coming in the Year of the Mammoth and gave their thoughts. They also talked in some cool detail about things that they go into in the design process. And so I wanted to do a review of this video. There were some points that I agreed with, there were some points that I didn't agree with, and some things that I wish they had talked about more. We're going to look at more of the points that I had some contention with, but some of the good things that they talked about in this was the ladder floors for the ranked ladder that are going to be coming up, where you won't be able to fall below a certain rank. I think that is a good implementation, and that's going to mean more people get to Legend, but that's totally okay. And another thing they talked about is the Hall of Fame cards. They give some good explanations for why some cards are be moving to the Hall of Fame in the set rotation, and a lot of those cards were because they were played too often. So I do agree with most of those changes. But in some of the answers to the questions, I felt like the answers they gave were off the mark. And so we're going to look at some of these questions. So I'm going to give you my thoughts of them. We'll just listen to the devs talk, and then we'll talk about each one afterwards. It's a little quiet, so you'll have to probably turn up your volume for hearing them speak.
Will you reverse the nerf for cards like Blade Flurry, Molten Giant, and put them in Hall of Fame? It's a good question. I think each card has its own individual answer, as these are very different cards. Molten Giant is something we've talked about. The reason that it's dangerous in Standard is because really the solution people use for Molten Giant is doing 15 or 20 points of burst damage in one turn, so that the Warlock players, mostly Warlock players, couldn't just play the Molten Giants and taunt them up. Now, we've moved away from being able to do 15 to 20 points of burst damage in one turn in Standard, and we kind of want to keep moving away from that, although there will still be some decks that do it. It's just sort of a price that you have to pay to do it is what counts.
Okay, so this is more important for when he talks later as well, because I think this will contradict some of the things he says in future on the other points. However, just to highlight what he was saying there, they nerfed Molten Giant because they didn't like to reward decks for saving up 15 to 20 points of burst damage. And yet that seems like exactly what we're playing in right now in the meta, doesn't it? In fact, your opponents are normally doing that much burst damage in an earlier turn than any turn 10 combo. An aggro shaman can do 2 lava bursts and a lightning bolt with spell power, immediately pulling off over 15 damage for only 7 mana on that turn. When he talks about combo decks later as well, I think this is going to be an important point to highlight. But suffice to say, at this point, he's saying they don't like decks with 15 to 20 points of burst damage in them, and they didn't want Molten Giant to be problematic for other decks that didn't kill you in that way. So this was only more of a minor concern, but it will be important when we look at some of the things for later. All right, the next highlight is at 3220.
Bit of that kind of stuff for a little bit later. Here's a question from Dog from Twitch chat. Do you feel the rate of expansion release is appropriate? Do you think at the current rate the content stays fresh for long enough?
Right, so one of the obvious answers to this is, hey, we're doing 3 big expansions now because people have been asking us for, can you release more content? The expansions have a big impact, but the adventures have a smaller impact. One of the reasons why we're going to 3 big expansions per year, and we'll see that with this year. And as we go forward, we'll keep an eye on that to see, hey, is that enough? We noticed that in digital games like Hearthstone, content gets consumed very quickly, especially with our huge streaming community. The streamers show off, here's an awesome deck, here's the best version of that deck. Everybody is up to speed suddenly on that deck, and then it gets posted on all these different websites, and that proliferation of all those ideas in those decks is so fast that people often feel like they've consumed content before the next expansion comes out. Something that we're seeing occasionally, though, is people will discover new decks. Recently, we saw the aggressive rogue deck show up at the last 2 winter championships for Europe and NA, and it's really interesting to see people discover a new deck like that this late into the season. And it shows like, hey, maybe people can still be rewarded for being creative even this late into the season. So I think we're going to keep an open mind, see how it goes. but it's a good question.
Yeah, I also think that we're starting to wonder. Like, there's kind of a couple things that could make a meta feel stale, right? One of them is the balance is out of whack, and so everyone's playing the best deck, and so the experiences you're having playing are just kind of the same every time because you're playing against the same decks or playing the same decks. So that can make the game feel stale. But even like if you just extrapolate a kind of a well-balanced meta over time, eventually people will settle on some decks, and even in a world where decks have very close win rates to each other, you could still end up with the meta feeling stale over time. And I think that's actually, I tried to share some stats about this. I think that's where we kind of ended up in some cases with the Mean Streets metagame, is that decks are closer to each other in balance than they have been in some other metas, and yet there's still a feeling that the meta is stale and we're seeing the same things over and over again. And so I've been wondering, and the team has been wondering, is there a holistic change that makes sense to make? Because even if we hit okay on balance, and I don't think that we're making some balance changes, so I'm not sure that we've done that yet, but even if we hit perfectly there, is the game still not changing fast enough? Is our content release cadence right? I think there's upsides and downsides to making our content releases slower or faster, but I mean,
I'm just going to stop him there. The main thing that he's saying here, and I wanted to go back to what Mike said before, but we'll look at it again just to refresh. The main thing that I think Ben is missing here is that the content is stale not because of the rate that it was released at. The content is stale because there's nothing you can do outside of playing the best deck. And what Mike had said at the start was that it's in our fault as a community somewhat to blame, that we are consuming the content too fast. This was what he said, and that when a streamer finds a good deck and they share it, and then suddenly everyone's using a good deck, that's what makes the meta become stale. And I think in part this is true, but there are more things wrong with that statement than correct. First, the meta, I feel at this point, is most stale because the most powerful decks choose to end the game before any choices can really be relevant. The game may be well balanced on the statistics that Ben Brode quotes us, but it's not enjoyable to play if I'm not doing anything as the player. When you have your games aiming to end by turn 4, the only thing I can do as a player is try to implement a strategy that has turn 3 or earlier. Having anything outside of this realm means that I'm probably not going to win, and that's what kills the game at this point. On the second issue, there shouldn't be a best deck. We can't be to blame for there being a best deck. The best deck is created through the numbers printed on the cards. And if there is a best deck out there that we find that's beating all the other ones, it probably shouldn't be the best deck anymore. That's Blizzard's responsibility to have seen that coming or prevent it before it becomes so atrociously a problem for the game that people stop playing. I think that that's really bad to try to blame the rate we're consuming the content on the meta feeling stale. The meta feels stale because you can't do anything outside of killing your opponent really early in the game with a pirate deck. And they could have seen that coming a mile away. We'll talk about this more later in the next points as well that they continue to make, so we'll move on. 3740. This is on YouTube, by the way, if you wanted to watch along. I'll put the link for it in the YouTube description.
Like another kind of twist on that is like combo in general. How do you feel about that as an archetype? Where's like the right place for that to go in Hearthstone? What are like good combos and bad combos? Because I think we sometimes feel like we're sending the message that we don't.
I just want to pause. I love this part where Ben asked a question that didn't seem like it was from, the plan on the computer screen. He's just asking this to Mike, and we get an honest answer from Mike. And let's listen to this answer of what good and bad combo decks represent.
I don't like combo because when people see us moving cards like Power Overwhelming or Ice Lance, that's kind of the feeling some players get.
Yeah, when we have, so there's a couple different types of combos. A lot of combos would love to be able to kill you in one turn, right? They can kill you from 30 damage in one turn with no interaction, and we try to shy away from that type of combo. Ideally, the combo still does a bunch of tricky stuff, maybe even in one turn, but instead of killing you, it gets a big advantage either on the board or card advantage or some other kind of advantage. So those are probably a more healthy type of combo, or combos that take a few turns to set up in some way. So we're going to try to design to that, but it's a really difficult space because, if players just find out one slight tweak, sometimes it turns from, an interesting combo to, oh my god, you're dead.
So this sounds well and good when he says it, but I think this is the part where you start to stop drinking the Kool-Aid, because Mike is saying to us here that a bad combo is something that kills you in one turn. It's something that ends the game all at once by killing you. Yet, in this very expansion that we just received, we got Kun, the Druid card, which enables exactly that. In fact, in a number of ways. You can use Kun with Malagos, you can use Kun with Cthulhu. They specifically enabled for this expansion a combo which, when assembles its pieces, not only kills you but does exceptionally more than that much damage. With a Cthulhu Kun Druid, you can do upwards of 90 damage. This completely goes against the design philosophy that he's telling me here. It's really hard for me to get on board and nod my head and say that's a good idea when the game in front of us is not represented that way. And this wasn't as if it was some old idea. Kun was introduced this expansion. So, has he changed his opinion since the start of this expansion? I think it's easy to forget that that's there, because we're dying on turn 4. Not many people are actually getting to play Kun Aviana combos. And whether it rotates or not, he specifically said that they don't like those combos, yet they added Kun at this moment. And that's really hard for me to take in his opinion after that point. Let's move on, though. Next one is at 49.25.
We have another Twitch chat question from Linuxian. Were there any cards aside from Spirit Claws and Small Time Buccaneers that you were thinking of nerfing? Yeah, we talked about a lot of different cards. We talked about cards from Classic, and for those cards we decided, hey, let's use our Wild rotation, making them exclusive to Wild as our place to put Classic cards. And that's what we did with cards like Ice Lance, which was like a card that we've been worried about for a long time. And we also talked about cards that were rotating out, right, a month later or whatever the next expansion comes out, because those cards, they're leaving pretty soon anyway, so they weren't great targets for nerfs. And we actually chose 2 cards that are going to be around for the next year at least, so that our nerfs are having an impact. So that's why we ended up with those 2 in particular. But yeah, there's more candidates. We'll see what happens after that. I think it'll make aggro a little bit worse. We're worried that when Reno leaves, control will also be worse.
Okay, I specifically remember this part. Mike says something here, and then Ben will also say something, which are completely different points, but both relevant to our discussion. That moment when he says, we're worried when Reno rotates, control is going to be worse, that makes my heart sink. That's his only concern. Control right now doesn't exist without Reno. Even when you Reno on turn 6, you can die before turn 10. There is nothing in the game that's going to let you survive right now other than Renoing your life back. So they better have some better plans than being a little worried about control suffering to aggro once Reno leaves. I'm not a particularly big fan of Reno's ability to swing the game, but it's clear that you cannot survive the onslaught right now if you're not prepared with some way to heal yourself in most matchups.
And aggro will gain a lot more of a foothold because of that, but there's so many new cards. We'll have to see. We'll keep an open mind and we'll do what we need to do.
I think it's important to make it a set that's exciting and take some risks, and then come in and nerf some cards later. That's more important than being very conservative and missing the other way, where a set has very little impact on the meta. So, but we are gonna watch things. I think and I mentioned this in the blog I did about balance and shamans and stuff is we're working on technology to patch in balance changes at a different pace than we have in the past. But that's still something we're working on.
That's still something they're working on. This is a completely separate point from what Mike is making, but Ben says here that they design the cards with the idea that they're going to, take a risk and be able to change it later. This is what he says to us, is how they design the cards. And yet, finishing that statement, he says, but we're not prepared with the technology to change the cards in a fast order yet. How do those things go together? How can he say that they design cards with the idea they would change them, but, well, we've seen how long it takes to make changes. We all know this firsthand now. And finish that statement and say, but we're not prepared to do it yet. You can't have those two things together. And I think that shows a big disconnect in what they're trying to design versus the technology at their disposal. This isn't an indie game. This is $100 million go into this game. We as the consumer are going to need a better product for what we're putting into it. And that's just unacceptable that your own design philosophy is incorporating being able to change the cards, yet you acknowledge you don't have the ability to do that properly. The next one is at 5450, and I believe this is the last direct section that we're going to be looking at. This is a big one. This is pretty long. There's going to be a number of points in this that get made.
Hall of Fame too. That's something that you guys can give us more feedback on in the future.
Hero San from Twitch chat. Can you share some insights on how the testing process works for new content, and would you ever consider some kind of public test server? I'll answer the second part of that. Do you want to talk about how we test new content?
Sure. Yeah. So we go through about 8 months on every expansion, 8 months of game design on every expansion. We spend about 4 months on what we call initial design and 4 months on what we call final design. We test out major mechanics a lot during initial design and individual cards to make sure they have some good gameplay. But final design is where we get down to the real nitty-gritty, and that's when we start talking about, hey, is this card balanced? Is this card gonna create good gameplay or unfun gameplay? Is it gonna be skill testing, or is it just gonna be, something that everyone's just gonna run out on turn one? And as we go along, we learn more and more about that. We've gotten a lot of feedback from the community that the one drops are too powerful or not fun to play against, and certainly we're gonna adjust and pay a lot of attention to our one drops.
Let's pause here for a second. So we're talking about the one drop problem, and he says we've gotten a lot of feedback from the community that one drops are too good and they're not fun to play against. Didn't we learn this in the Undertaker meta? I've played Hearthstone through every expansion. In Naxxramas there was a card Undertaker, which was a 1-mana card that scaled ridiculously with Death Rattle minions to the point that you would end up big game hunting it in some matches. It was clear at this point how powerful one drops could be and how much they could balance the game. Here we are so many expansions later, and we're saying the same thing. We're saying one drops are too strong. And not only that, they're saying they didn't realize it until they released the cards. It took us as a community to tell them these one drops are too good and the games are decided on turn 4. I'm not having fun just putting my one drop on the board and hoping it wins the game. To think that they went through the balance testing this expansion on Small Time Buccaneer and felt that that was going to be an acceptable inclusion to have a Pirate Synergy card that traded with every 2-drop. That seems really outrageous, doesn't it? It doesn't inspire a ton of faith because we've seen that mistake happen in Hearthstone time and time again. It feels like they should have acknowledged that problem before the community had to tell them it was one this expansion, just through raw numbers on their own side of things when doing balance testing. But there's more to be said here.
So I think that we'll keep iterating on that, but we play a lot of games. There's no way we're going to know for sure exactly how powerful a card is with just a small internal team playing. It often takes the community, days, weeks, or months with millions of people.
Let's stop for a second there. So in this expansion, Pirate Warrior was around by day 3. Maybe someone's made a tech choice, you got a South Sea Captain in it now, but I was playing to Legend on the 3rd day, and you would just queue into Pirate Warrior over and over, and that deck hasn't changed much. This statement means either they didn't see Pirate Warrior coming, or they tested Pirate Warrior and felt that that was a fun way to play the game, and that would be rewarding to players. Now, they probably didn't see Aggro Shaman being as strong as it was, but you think after Shaman had just been dominant for the entire previous expansion through a round of nerfs. Hey, does anyone remember Tuskar Totemic? Boy, that was a ridiculous card, wasn't it? Through a round of nerfs, Shaman still kept its dominance, with weapons being one of the key features. Then you released more cards that synergize with weapons, as well as just some generically good Jade Shaman cards that have worked out pretty well. You think that this would have come up at some point, and it doesn't give me a lot of faith that they made this expansion clearly intending for Pirate Warrior to be the way it is, and missing the mark on a different aggro deck at the same time. Neither of those things should have occurred if you were going to have an enjoyable game through Mean Streets. Let's keep listening.
Playing them to find out how powerful the deck is, and we can't really simulate that. So what we do is we try to aim for, like, hey, let's make these cards about 8 out of 10. And we know that we're going to miss by plus or minus 1, so maybe the cards will end up being 9 out of 10 or 7 out of 10.
Just want to pause here for a second again. He says something really important here that's part of their design philosophy. When they're designing cards, they want to make them an 8 out of 10. And that they're aware that they're going to miss. And I'm not going to fault them for not knowing every deck is going to be a thing, because there's no way anyone is going to figure out every deck. That would not be possible for the balance team. But there's a problem here with this design philosophy. If you're designing every card to be, or every playable card, not to mention the garbage ones we get each expansion, to be an 8 out of 10, then each time you release a new expansion, that relative number has increased, and your new 8 out of 10 has to power creep what you just made. The Jade cards, I think, are a great example of this. Neutral cards do not compete with Jade or normal classic cards do not compete with Jade cards. I'm never going to get to play a Chill Wind Yeti again, at least not until Jade cards go away, because Chill Wind Yeti is going to lose really badly to someone playing a Jade deck. And that means each future expansion has to be 8 out of 10 better than Jade, or at least slightly better than Jade. We're not going to be able to see any of the new mechanics come. This just feels like an endless power creep balance design. Why can't we have the cards be of equal or at least similar power level while having different mechanics attached to them? I feel that this is a much better way to design the game than simply power creeping each expansion on top of each other.
And you know, it's not an exact measure. But we try to aim for that number, and we know that some will be super powerful and exciting, some won't. And when we think a card supports a really fun archetype or a really interesting archetype or skill testing archetype, sometimes we'll push it to be more powerful than that. We'll push it up to 9 out of 10, and we'll play test it even more to increase our accuracy on that individual card. But there's so many different cool deck types that get built once we put the cards out that we can never know for sure. And I think that's kind of the great thing about Hearthstone is players figuring out the decks themselves. We want to give you the tools to do that, and we're going to try and do that more and more. So
I feel like something is going unsaid here, and that's that we have Hunter and Paladin completely unplayable this expansion. He's talking about how they want to let the players design the decks, how, you know, see the players create these cool things, and they don't know what we're going to come up with, but it'll sure be interesting. And yet they release cards that are of completely different balance appropriations. We have 2 unplayable classes. Shaman is massively overrepresented compared to other. It just feels like it wasn't anywhere close to what he's talking about. These words would be great if they materialized in the game that I could go and play every day, but it doesn't feel like I get that experience that he's talking about.
So that, you know, we can't predict, but we realize that we can't predict, and we're just going to let you guys figure it out, find some cool stuff. If the stuff is broken, then at least we made some cool, awesome stuff and let you guys explore it yourselves, and we'll just make changes afterwards.
Regarding a public test server, I think that actually one of the biggest problems we're facing right now is how long is new content fun for? And putting new content on a PTR of some kind just makes players start using that content weeks or months before it goes live, and then is it stale day one? Do we launch the expansion with solved meta? doesn't sound like the most fun version of the game.
Well, I agree with one part of this, which is if you release the content early through a test server, it can make it, less exciting when it does get released. However, I think this is missing a key point, which is what's making this meta stale, and that they seem to have ignored in the entire process here, which is that the games are ending on turn 4. When you queue a game of Hearthstone, the outcome is decided by turn 4. This is what makes the game stale. I can't come up with a strategy that doesn't happen earlier than turn 3. And, if that had gone to at least some other external level of testing, even if it wasn't completely open, but if you had had a couple hundred more people working on it, it might have come up that this wasn't an enjoyable style of Hearthstone to play. I'm not sure how much they've actually committed to playing in this meta when they say these things, because it feels like they don't realize we're not having fun because the games are decided without us putting in any ability as the player. I want to have a meta where I can create and build things like they're talking about, but that's simply not the game experience right now. I think to leave on this with some closing thoughts is that a lot of these points they make, I think, come from a good place, but it's a place of looking to the future all the time. And, this is the stream for the Year of the Mammoth. Of course, they'll talk about the future, but this feels like the outlook they take to the game most of the time of what's coming next. I mean, heck, we're thinking about Ungaro. They're already working on the cards for the expansion to come after that one. And this is just too much. I want the game to be fun now, and I'm always going to say that. I'm always going to wake up and say, I want Hearthstone to be fun now. It's cool if it's fun later too, but if it's not fun now, I'm not going to play it every day. And I think that's where a lot of people are getting off the ship this expansion. You needed to realize that the game is being decided so early, or games being decided without the player inputting anything into it, is just not fun, more than the deck archetypes or the ladder experience. You have to stop making the games end early, and to do that you need to balance test more and make sure that you're releasing a product that won't end up broken for 3 months and have the fires burning around you. This is going to end my review of their live stream Q&A. You could see the full thing in the link in the video description. Thanks for watching, guys.